Diablo 4 got a complete overhaul. For Season 4, rather than add new seasonal mechanics, Blizzard completely reworked major systems of the game at a fundamental level. There's way too many changes for me to even comment on it all. There's hundreds of changes. There's over 10,000 words in the patch notes. But what I want to do is talk about, from a game design point of view, the main thrust of what they're doing and why. I'll give you some analysis on the changes to the item and crafting system, and these changes have gotten overwhelmingly positive reception by players and by me too, but there is part of it, a feature called tempering, that is a bit controversial, and I find the whole thing a really good case study on game design. So let's get into it. Before we talk about the specific changes in Season 4 of Diablo 4, I think we need some context. If we look at one of the changes they've implemented, how do we know if this is a good or bad idea? So to take a step way back, Diablo 4 and other games in its genre are trying to create a certain kind of experience. They're trying to offer players progression, a feeling of progression over a long period of time, over hundreds or thousands of hours. I think it is important to state what is the point of this genre and game so we can evaluate these specific design changes to see if they reinforce that point or not. So Diablo 4 does not want you to have a full powered character that has every piece of gear you could imagine in 5 minutes or an hour or 10 hours or 100 hours. They don't want you to hit a wall of progression. They want you to keep getting more and more stuff somehow over this very long period of time. So they're scaling up the power of items you get as you progress further in the game. But also at any point along that progression, there is a huge amount of randomness. And that's what this is really all about. This video and the changes in Season 4, randomness and the specific way it works is really the key. Before Season 4, any item of your gear, like your helm or your gloves or whatever else, they all have 4 different stat lines that are called affixes in Diablo. And I really hate that term. I wish they could call them something else. The point is there were 4 of them on every piece of gear. So one might be plus 22 dexterity, or another one might be plus 12% fire damage to crowd-controlled enemies or something like that. Just think for a moment about the extreme amount of randomness that's involved. So when an item drops, it's sort of analogous to if you were to draw 4 marbles out of a huge jar of marbles that represents all possible kinds of stats that could ever go on that gear. So one of the hundreds of marbles in this jar is the intelligence marble. If you draw that one, then the gear will get plus intelligence. But inside that marble is a dice roll. Yes, that line of stats will give you intelligence, but how much intelligence? That's a dice roll. So now it's a randomness inside of randomness. And that means there's, I don't know, I haven't computed it, but trillions of possible types of gear that could drop. This situation with the randomness was really good and also really bad at the same time. What's really good about it is that by having trillions of possible pieces of gear that could drop, they've ensured that it's going to take a long time to get what you need. And yeah, I know we can look at that cynically as a time-wasting grind, but they do need something of this sort going on because they really can't give you everything in 5 minutes or 1 hour or whatever in this style of game. So on the one hand, the more randomness, the better. But on the other hand, that amount of randomness is really miserable. Diablo 3 had the same kind of thing going on when it launched. In that game, when a piece of gear dropped, also it's one of trillions or something. And so there's an astronomically likely chance that it's going to be garbage. And it was the same story back then and the same kind of problem. They wanted to have so much randomness, but they just went too far and it was too extreme. So they implemented something back in Diablo 3 called smart loot, which means if you're playing a monk, for example, you would not get barbarian gear. Yes, when Diablo 3 launched, the pool of gear you were pulling from was so big that it would include gear that other classes would use. So again, it was astronomically likely that every piece of gear you see is going to be garbage. In Diablo 3, they did a bunch of things to address that. I'm not going to go into it, but one of the big things was they said, okay, it's a little much to have barbarian gear drop when you're playing the monk. Let's cut that out. And now in Diablo 4, they needed to do something, not exactly that because they already took that step, but something analogous. the amount of loot that you're getting was just so overwhelmingly much that it's tedious. The main experience of the game was just reading through endless pieces of junk gear to find the 1 in a million gear that was any good. I hope you can see the tension here, where on the one hand, they want a ton of randomness. They don't even really want to get rid of randomness if they can get away with it, because they want it to take a long time to get the perfect gear. But on the other hand, they can't really have the main thing you do in the game be reading millions of pieces of junk. Now I'll go over the biggest changes to the item system and how they changed the randomness here. But you can't look at any one of these changes in isolation. They really all work together. The most important change in this entire overhaul, in my opinion, is the change to the Codex of Power. If the entire Season 4 was only this one change and nothing else, I think it would have been a massive improvement to the game. So it's incredible that they did that plus 100 other things. I'm not going to cover this Codex of Power issue in a lot of detail because I ranted for several minutes about it in another video. But just to give you the really short version is that each piece of your gear has a special power that can be attached to it, which is called an aspect. And in the old system, these aspects were really hard to juggle. You can think of them as like cards in your deck, and you make a deck of 10 or 12 powers for your character. But to move one from here to there, or dealing with replacing a piece of gear and then trying to get that same aspect on it again, and managing all this in your inventory was a total nightmare. It was so bad that I really think Diablo 4 should never have shipped with that system in place. So I'm really glad that they changed it. The change is a simple and straightforward change that when you get a piece of gear that has an aspect on it, you can go to the blacksmith and salvage it. And then it goes in a nice user interface called your Codex of Power, where it doesn't take up inventory space. And now you can put it on any piece of gear you want forever for the rest of the game. Even though I think that is the biggest and most important change, I actually have the least design analysis to say about it because it was just really, really, really bad. And now it's sensible. And that's kind of all there is to say. It's all the rest of the stuff, which focuses on randomness, that needs a little more commentary. The first big change to how items work, other than the huge change to the Codex of Power, has to do with the stat lines or affixes for items. There are rare items, which are yellow in the game, and legendary items, which are more powerful, and they are orange in the game. In the old version of the game, all the item types had 4 affixes or stat lines on them. But in the new revamp, the yellow items have only 2 affixes, and the more powerful orange items have only 3, not 4. I used the analogy a moment ago about drawing marbles out of a jar to determine which affixes you have. Well, you're drawing fewer marbles, but also the jar has way fewer marbles in it to begin with now because they got rid of tons of the more esoteric type of affixes that could go on gear. Players and even the developers referred to a lot of those affixes as damage on Tuesday type of things. There'd be a bunch of conditionals, and if you met all of them, then you'd get 22% extra damage or whatever it is. So they greatly simplified these affixes. They got rid of all of the damage on Tuesday stuff. There's just way fewer and simpler marbles in the jar to draw, and then on the yellows, you only have to draw 2 of them. So it's much, much, much easier to get a yellow that is pretty much good for your build. And likewise, it's much easier to get an orange that's good for your build because you only need the stars to align 3 times rather than 4. Another mechanic to keep in mind, it's not new, it was there before and it's still there now, but it's relevant to this, is that you can re-roll one of those affixes. The way this works is you can re-roll exactly 1 affix on a piece of gear. So if you re-roll the second line, for example, it means that you're never going to be able to change the first and third affixes, but you could pay gold over and over and over and over again to get new rolls of that second line. And I don't mean like if it's plus 20 dexterity, you're getting different kinds of dexterity. I mean, you're getting any possible affix that could ever be on that gear in that new line. So if your yellow piece of gear has only 2 lines and you can re-roll one of them, or your orange piece of gear has 3 lines and you can re-roll one of them, that's way easier to get the stars to align, to get a usable piece of gear now than it was when they all had 4 affixes. So that's the first change to the randomness here, but is it good or bad? Well, we can't judge it in isolation until you hear the rest of the parts. You might think it's bad and that it becomes way too easy to get a perfect piece of gear really quickly, and that undermines the whole thing the game is going for, but that is not actually true. There's multiple things going on here that allow that change to be fine and good. The thing about the yellow piece of gear having only 2 affixes on them, that is a little bit controversial with players, but I think it's a really good change, actually. It just means that in the very early game where you care about those pieces of gear, it's even easier on new players. When several pieces of gear drop, you just quickly read them. They each have 2 lines on them, and you pick the best one and you move on. It's kind of a non-issue because you graduate to the more powerful orange type of gear pretty soon anyway. And with the orange type of gear, through many, many hours of the game, it's totally fine that it's much easier to get a really good piece of gear now than it was before, because you are replacing all of that gear as you go anyway. You're leveling up, you're doing harder content, and you're getting more and more powerful items. So who cares if your level 25 chess piece is like really extra good when in a few minutes you're going to have to replace it anyway? So what this change really does to your first few dozen hours of playing Diablo 4 is make it easier to get gear that actually applies to your character and doesn't have a bunch of useless skills and doesn't involve you having to read through so many useless skills to just get to few that work. It just makes the whole thing feel better and flow better. And we don't even get to the potential problems here of getting perfect gear quickly until we get to the end, until you've leveled up completely. So if that was it, if that was the end of the story, it actually would create a huge problem once you got to that point, but it's not the end of the story. There's one small, simple feature that I think is really clever called greater affixes. And it doesn't solve this endgame problem, but it just gives them a little more runway to work with before we get to the rest of the features. What a greater affix means is that any of your affixes on a piece of gear has a very small chance to be a greater affix. And if it is, it gets a special icon, and the value that it rolls is 150% of the normal maximum value. For example, if some piece of gear had an affix that could give you plus fire damage, and that range could be somewhere between plus 5% and plus 20%, then if it's a greater affix, then instead of being the max 20, it's actually plus 30%, 50% more than the usual maximum. I think this is a really clever use of randomness on Blizzard's part. What they did is they took something that was super random, and it's still super random, but they shifted around where the randomness is, and it has a huge effect on how it feels to play. In the old system, you were trying to get the stars to align 4 times on 4 different affixes, and it was super low probability. In the new system, the equivalent would be getting all greater affixes. I don't know exactly how the probabilities compare, but I bet they're actually pretty close either way. It's probably even harder to get the stars to align with 3 greater affixes, even though there's a smaller jar of marbles to pull from, than it was in the old system. But it feels way better because it means that most of the time you're getting something reasonable, and then it's really hard to get something very good. In the old system, most of the time you would get absolute garbage. So that's the huge difference. They've made the chase rares no easier to get here. In fact, probably harder, but they've made the average experience feel way better. There's 2 more big systems here, tempering and masterworking. You're going to encounter tempering first, very early in the game, and masterworking at the very end of the game. But I want to talk about masterworking first, because it's going to be easier to understand why tempering even exists at all. The masterworking feature is a crafting system that is very simple, and I think really solid design for what Diablo 4 is trying to be. It replaces an upgrade system that was so simple that it really didn't even need to exist at all. The way the old system works is you would go to the blacksmith and you would click on a piece of gear 5 times to upgrade it to level 5. And that was it. And you'd never think about it again. So why did you even need to do it in the first place? The masterworking system is the other end of the spectrum. It is really long of a process on purpose so that it can be a big deal that eventually pays off with big rewards. You can upgrade a piece of gear 12 times, but you don't just click 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 12. You have to spend valuable materials in order to do each one of those clicks. You have to do a new endgame activity called the Pit, which has several levels between 1 and 200, getting harder and harder. So you start at pit level 1 and you complete it, and you get just a little bit of crafting material, which will get you through part of one of those clicks. Each of the 12 upgrades makes all of the values on all of your affixes 5% better, except the 4th, 8th, and 12th will give a random one plus 25%, which is an absolutely huge bonus. And if you get lucky, you could get plus 25 times 3 if you happen to get the same one all 3 of those times. That would take a long time to do, which is what they want. You'd have to get way far in the pit, get a lot of crafting materials. Also, you can reset your masterwork. So let's say you got to level 4 or 8 on an item and you don't like which affix got that juicy plus 25% boost. Well, you can pay some gold and reset back to 0 masterwork and try again. I think the masterworking system is really good because it does what the game is trying to do. It meets the game's design objectives here. It's a long form upgrade system that has good rewards and it's tied to a challenging end game activity. Great. So are we done? What's the problem? Well, there's 2 possible problems here, and the tempering feature exists as an attempt to solve both of them. The 2 problems created by all of this are, 1, didn't we dumb the game down too much earlier when we made the stats a lot fewer and simpler? And then 2, didn't we create too easy of a possibility that the player will just never pick up another pair of gloves again or never pick up a chess piece again? Let's think about those separately. So on the issue of dumbing things down, there were a bunch of stats that might have been good for a certain build or something, and now they just don't appear at all. So that's good in that all of the other builds don't have to sift through endless piles of junk of stats that are never going to apply to them. But it's bad in that, what if you wanted that kind of thing to enable your build? Blizzard really solved that with this tempering system. You can actually do a lot more with specialized stats on gear. It's just that it doesn't appear in the normal pool of gear that everyone sees all the time. It's something that you intentionally add to your piece of gear. Maybe tempering could have worked by having just a list of things you can add to your gear and you click on the ones that you want and that's it. But that is not how it works. I think Blizzard really wanted to keep more randomness in play. They took away a ton of randomness by reducing the number of stats and the number of affixes that are on a piece of gear. And so they wanted to move that randomness somewhere else, and they moved it to the tempering system. So you choose which manual you want to use, and the actual stat line you want might be 1 of 3 or 4 or 5. And then it randomly will choose one and apply it to the piece of gear. You could try again and again, but here is the kicker. There's a limited number of times you can try. You only get 5 tries on a piece of gear, and then you can never try again. This is the controversial thing. Players call it bricking your item. They do not mean making it literally unusable. You can still use your item. It just means that the extra ability that you added to it via tempering, it might be one of the 5 that does nothing for your build, and you'd be stuck with that one. I can see both sides of the issue on this kind of hot topic on, is this a good idea or not? This also ties in with the second problem I said that was looming out there, which is, won't players never need to pick up another chess piece again or something? So if it was relatively easy to get a perfect stars align pair of gloves or something, and then you were to spend a long time masterworking it to be perfect, that part's cool. The part where you spend a long time masterworking it, okay, they like that. But the first part where you get the perfect pair of gloves, it means you would never pick up another pair of gloves again. And it kind of undermines what Diablo 4 is going for. They can't really have that. That is why the tempering manuals work the way they do. You might get that perfect pair of gloves and then you try to temper it to add the special extra lines you want and you fail. And now you're going to need to find another pair of perfect gloves. So what this does is It allows Blizzard to make it a little bit easier to get that perfect pair of gloves than they would otherwise be able to. But in the end, it means you have more of a reason to keep collecting gear. You don't just get perfect gloves once and you're done forever. You might need a few tries of tempering. And it's kind of analogous to the greater affix thing, where what they're doing is they're making the average experience way better than it was before by letting you have perfect gloves more easily, by letting you have a collection of stats that does anything for your build more easily. But then they're making the really chase rare, like best perfect thing still really hard to get. The other side of this argument is that no matter how much game design logic you try to throw at someone, the experience of having your really awesome, perfect rolled gear temper and be bricked is so bad, so heartbreaking that it just shouldn't be that way, maybe. I'm a little torn because by having those lows of how bad it can go, it makes it all the more exciting and thrilling when it actually works out. And it's kind of good if the game can make you feel anything. So there's a positive, but I also get that it is quite a feel bad. And I wonder if Blizzard is going to revisit the system and maybe change it. I'm not sure exactly how, though. I feel like they're a little bit backed into a corner where players are going to come at this and say, can't we just re-roll tempers forever? I think the most likely solution that we'll see from Blizzard here, so they might just do nothing and leave it, and maybe that's fine. But I bet you they're going to add a way to reset the number of times you can temper a given item, but have it be super rare and difficult and something you only do once in a great while. But by having that exist, it sort of keeps hope alive for that really valuable, super well-rolled item that you otherwise would have bricked. That's it for now. And if you enjoyed this, you can check out a game I designed, Yomi 2, which is a fighting card game you can get on Steam right now.